Hello again. Dan Alasso, Making History. And when I said that I would begin writing and making videos about the intersections of religion and politics in American history, I mentioned that I've been very interested in this topic from really before the start of my studies to become a historian. And so what I've been doing is I have been going back to a backup drive on which I've got all of the things that I have written, journals, papers, research, everything. And I have started kind of looking back through that, which I found very interesting. And one of the things that I found was a journal entry at the end of my very first semester in the master's program at what at the time was called Mankato State University. And I reflected in March 2006 that the research I've been doing has been really interesting, the reading of the 3 books on Reconstruction, as well as the Bradlaugh stuff. But what am I going to have to show for it? In the case of the 3 books on Reconstruction, I wrote my 2 required book reviews, but I'm not sure I got anything out of that, besides learning how to write a book review, which was basically pointless, I said. The Bradlaugh stuff is much more interesting in its own right. The whole thing about Charles Bradlaugh is that he seems to represent a liberal, secular position at its precise zenith in England. The secular position, I said, was beaten back by a unified religious establishment and by an emerging metaphysical political philosophy, Marxism, which required the same type of faith and trust in external authority as did the religions, I thought. The liberal position which came out of this secularism asserted that individuals could improve their own circumstances and those of their children. And that's what I was interested in. This led to Charles Bradlaugh advocating birth control, education, unions, the expansion of the franchise, and republicanism, all of which give the individual increased control over the details of their lives. The opposition closed in on both sides, I said. The conservatives wanted to maintain their positions as the elite, which required the lower classes to basically shut up and do their jobs. The Marxists wanted the lower class to stay where it was, but to become conscious of itself, so that it could fulfill its role in the historical dialectic. They criticized the impulse of the workers and those like Charles Bradlaugh who encouraged them to improve themselves so that they could join the middle class. In an ironic twist, they also basically wanted the poor to shut up and do their historical jobs. So that was what I thought in 2006. As time passed, I became much more reconciled to the idea that writing a book review or even an abstract was a valuable skill to develop. I also decided that I would pursue the story of Charles Bradlaugh with the ultimate goal of writing a comprehensive kind of life and times style of biography. I found a very cool map of London that had been drawn and printed in Bradlaugh's lifetime, which was 1833 to 1891. And I had it printed as a poster that I hung in my study so that I could visualize his environment and his movements around the city. I haven't completed that task yet, and I think I have that map still folded up in a folder in a box somewhere. Maybe it's getting near time to resume that work. When I moved to New England and began a PhD program at UMass, I was particularly interested in the secular tradition in Western Massachusetts. Bradlaugh and his friend and co-worker, Annie Besant, had been hauled in front of the Queen's Bench in 1878 on charges that they had reprinted a birth control book called The Fruits of Philosophy, which had been written in 1831 by Dr. Charles Knowlton of Ashfield, Massachusetts. Ashfield was just a short side trip on my commute to school from Keene, New Hampshire to Amherst. So I went there. And I found a wealth of stories to pursue. Much more on that later. I told a very smart and very senior UMass labor historian named Bruce Laurie about my interest in the secularists. He was not extremely interested, except to the extent that this group might overlap with early labor unionists. He did give me a file folder filled with a little bit of information on a character named William Hayton, who lived from 1801 to 1871, and who had been the leader of the Philadelphia Working Men's Party, about whom there were some unanswered questions that he thought I should run down. The topic was mildly interesting to me, but really only to the extent that it might overlap with Philadelphia secularism. So, not really that great of a match. I continued my search for a mentor and an advisor. But I kept reading a lot, including not only primary sources, but old histories. I discovered that although not every historian a century ago had focused on religion and irreligion in American politics, some did. And one of these was Anson Eli Morse, who lived from 1879 to 1966, who was the son of an Amherst College history professor and whose Princeton doctoral dissertation, published in 1909, was called The Federalist Party in Massachusetts to the year 1800. And I include a link to that so that you can take a look at it yourself if you're interested. A guiding assumption of this book, which devotes a lot of space to the radicals of Western Massachusetts, was that, quote, in any investigation of the various phases of the history and development of New England, we find that the predominating feature is religion. I read the book in December 2008, no doubt looking primarily for evidence of irreligion, but open to interesting information along the way. I should probably reread it, or at least scan the book once again to see what I might have missed. So here are some of the things that stood out to me at the time, and several of them with links to the sources that Morse cited, especially if they were available online. One thing that stood out to me early on was that there were various disunion projects, in Morse's words, that may have begun during the Revolutionary era, but that continued until at least the War of 1812. And some evidence of this was the address by Falkland, who was actually Fisher Ames, on a separation of the states, and another article on its consequences to New England in the Boston Sentinel of September 1808, which was then quoted in the Hampshire Gazette. Morse said that the Tories kind of failed and created a power vacuum, which was then occupied by the Federalists in Massachusetts. He said the growth and triumph of this party is the more remarkable in as much as it was contemporaneous with, but directly antagonistic to, the tide of democracy then sweeping the country. This would be in the 1810s. He then talks about the Essex result and Theophilus Parsons and describes that as kind of the beginning of federalism. And there's a link to a memoir of Theophilus Parsons here. Parsons apparently wrote John Hancock's proposition, which becomes and kind of paves the way for the Bill of Rights, and maybe makes it possible for John Hancock to support the Constitution. Morse quotes John Adams, saying, "I had at first no support from the Essex junto. They supported me timorously, and at the last would not go with me to so high a mark as I aimed at, which was a complete negative of the governor upon all laws." That is a veto. They made me, however, draw up the Constitution, and it was finally adopted, with some amendments very much for the worse. A foundation was here laid for much jealousy and unpopularity against me among the democratical people of this state. And in this, he's quoting from John Adams' Works, Volume 9. John Hancock's, quote, unparalleled popularity was also due to his affable manners, to his hospitality, and to his position as the representative of the bygone colonial aristocracy. And these, he suggests, are the people who had given up more power and property than anyone else in Massachusetts to make the revolution happen. Elbridge Gerry and James Warren, he says, were the head anti-federalists. But by general consent, there were two men, and two only, who were candidates for the first gubernatorial honors. The decision of the people lay between Hancock and Bowdoin. And he says that the vote for Hancock was overwhelming. In the Boston town meeting, Hancock had 858 votes out of 923. So what was it that made James Bowdoin a candidate by general consent then? He was the aristocracy's candidate? Hancock resigned from the governorship in 1785. His lieutenant, Cushing, was elected by the House by a vote of 134 to 89. But Bowdoin was elected by the Senate with a vote of 18 to 10. And this seems to confirm the people's objection to the aristocratic legislative settlement. Morse quotes, "The regulation of commerce through a general union of the colonies was advocated by Bowdoin as early as 1754, which would have been the year of Benjamin Franklin's Albany proposal. And during the era of the controversy over ratifying the Constitution," Morse says, "taking as a fair example the grievances and resolutions of the Hatfield Convention, which was August 22nd to 25th, 1786, it becomes clear that the people desired not a republican government, but a democratic one, as is evidenced by their proposal to do away with the Senate, to make the officers of government dependent on the legislature through annual appropriations of their salaries." Morse admits that, in his words, different elements were struggling upwards, the representatives of the new aristocracy, conscious that their position was not yet assured and that the people were moved to be a law unto themselves, felt most bitterly in regard to the common mass of people who were not disposed to grant them homage or obedience. And then we get the French Revolution, which I mentioned the other day. Morse says, "Dismayed conservatives continued to marvel at the impossible attempt of the French to establish their government on the foundation of a merely civil and atheistical morality." He goes on to quote, "The detestable principles of an atheistical philosophy have disgraced the best cause in the world." And for this, he's quoting the Massachusetts Spy from December 16th, 1795. And he continues, "But what operated most powerfully on the minds of the clergy were vivid accounts of the alarming prevalence of universal atheism and the official attacks on Christianity." On the growth of secularism, Morse says, "Ever since the American Revolution, there had existed not only a marked indifference to religion, but an actual and noticeable tendency toward irreligion and deism, if not downright atheism." And for this, Morse refers to Timothy Dwight, about whom a lot could be said. I've included a link to a biography of Dwight in Tyler's Three Men of Letters. Morse then notes that Volney visited Boston in the spring of 1797, and that the clerics went nuts. But this was not the beginning of what they began to call infidelity. Governor Bowdoin had felt called upon in June of 1785 to issue a proclamation for the encouragement of piety, virtue, education, and manners, and the suppression of vice. But on the atheist side, the sixth American edition of Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason was published by Isaiah Thomas in Worcester in 1794. And then Morse goes on for about 10 pages with lots of good quotes from preachers lamenting Paine's book and general infidelity throughout New England in the 1790s. And there's a lot of good material there. For example, "But a skeptic asks, would not a foreigner buy our newspapers, judge that religion was in danger? Yet how contradictory is this to truth? And who are they that are thus anxious about religion? Is it not that class of powerful and wealthy who are scarcely ever seen inside a place of worship?" So there's a lot of confusion and possibly some hypocrisy there in the words of the Salem Gazette from July 1796. In a 1797 issue of the Independent Chronicle and Universal Advertiser of Boston, a certain irreligious Piso remarks, quote, "It does not require much penetration to perceive the clergy are at their wits' end to recover the influence lost in the American Revolution. And it seems the conviction that the insubordination to the civil institutions of society, preached up to that day, produced consequent disrespect to religious institutions. That this is pretty generally understood, and from an analogy of reasoning, the same thing might happen again." And then a letter to the editor from a true Federalist indignantly complains that it has become quite fashionable for the clergy to blend a great measure of politics with the religious exercise. And then the writer goes on to abuse the Reverend Mr. Osgood liberally. But the clergy firmly supported the Federalists. The importance of the clergy's aid is recognized by the long extracts of or entire sermons printed in newspapers, beginning with Dr. Osgood's first partisan appeal of November 19th, 1794, Morse says. And all of this kind of radicalism and irreligion had tangible results. The Massachusetts Gazette had reported in March 1787 that Major Cookson informs us that not less than 700 families, inhabitants of the free western counties of this Commonwealth, that is Massachusetts, within about 6 weeks past, removed into the state of Vermont. This is 1787. Vermont was not an actual state of the American Union. It was a free state that was considering whether to join the Union or ally itself with Britain. This was all a result of Shays' Rebellion. The most probable reason for these moves, which I verified in my research in Ashfield, was an unwillingness to sign a loyalty oath to the new national government after the rebellion. And then the last thing that I wrote down, which is funny given that Anson Morse's father, Anson D. Morse, was an Amherst College professor, was that he says the founding of Amherst College as a refuge for Congregationalism, among other reasons, proves that Western Massachusetts, as late as 1826, had relaxed from Puritan rigidity far less than the coast. I'm not sure that I entirely agree with this. Amherst, like Northampton and Springfield, was a rich city located close to the Connecticut River, and the people who held power there were not the same people who had participated in Shays' Rebellion. People from the upcountry, I think, felt quite differently and weren't as down with Puritan Congregationalism. But I'll have more evidence of that to show you some other time. This is an example of the type of stuff that I got out of the books that I read early in my studies of American history as a PhD student at UMass. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.